Hey guys, how we doing today? My goal for this video is simple and hopefully will be very effective. It's to lay out a pathway for success on the research paper that is now becoming the singular focus of the next 3 weeks of this course, okay? While it is my goal and my plan to give you pretty significant academic freedom in how you choose to construct this paper, there are certain things that everybody has to do. And that is what I have been shooting for and aiming for in the component projects that we've been doing thus far, with writing your paper's proposal, writing out your literature review, writing out your data analysis. The students who took that very seriously are going to have a much easier time pulling this together. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through my expectations for all 5 of the sections, and then finish up today with a brief discussion of how you should be thinking about the data that you've just collected. What do I do with that? How does it make my point? How does it contribute to the overall theme and idea of the paper? Okay, so let's get into that. Let's get into it. Whenever I write a research paper, and that is kind of my job, is to write research papers, I very much utilize what's known as an hourglass philosophy. I think of the whole research project as something of an hourglass. And what I mean by that is the sections of the hourglass, and specifically the width, whether it's a very fat section of the hourglass or a very narrow section of the hourglass, that represents various paper sections. Okay, so I'll explain that in a bit more detail on the next slide, but let's go over the key functions of each section. All right. Your paper must have 5 concrete and distinct sections. It must have an introduction where it tells me what is this paper doing and what is this paper arguing. In other words, you have to set up a question and provide me with a very strong statement of intent about where the paper is ultimately going. Now, none of us, I think, are arrogant enough to believe that we are the only people who will be paying attention to this city or this social problem. And so, as a way of acknowledging the sociological work that has been done before you, or just, I would say, the scholarly work that has been done before you, the literature review is meant to provide background, scholarly context for the information that you personally have gathered, and the information that you will use to string together your analysis section at a later point. You have to have a data analysis, and that provides quantitative, measurable evidence that, yes, these ideas that I have put forward do indeed have relevancy within the city or the neighborhood or the county that I have chosen to analyze and write about. And then you wrap up with wrap up's the wrong word there. Let me start over. Then you move to what is the most important section of the paper, the sociological analysis. That is by orders of magnitude the most important section of the paper. That is where you will string together the concepts. I have been constantly pushing everybody in the class to identify 3 and only 3 concepts, social ideas that help you answer the question that you have posed. So I'm going to be looking, obviously, for thematic clarity across these sections. Does your introduction set up a logical question? Does it tell me what you're going to be proving or demonstrating, I should say? Proving is a bad word. Does the literature relate to the question that you've asked? Does the data analysis illuminate the themes that you've selected? And does the sociological analysis provide mechanisms through which that data tells me a story about the city or the neighborhood that you've chosen to analyze? And then you wrap up with a conclusion. Okay, so this paper I'd like it to be 12 to 15 pages. Sounds like a lot, but every time I assign something like this, what I always hear is towards the end of it is students saying, when I actually sat down to write it, I was kind of amazed at how much I already had. I wasn't writing 15 pages from scratch. I already had 7 to 8 to 9 already written, and I just needed to organize that into a proofread and a revised coherent product. Now, as for what this hourglass metaphor means, I think the width of the hourglass corresponds here to how broad or specific each section should ultimately be. So let's start up at the top. The first thing you write is obviously your paper's introduction, and that needs to be the broadest. You're asking a very broad question about an urban area. So you see how that corresponds to one of the fattest parts of the paper. That corresponds to one of the fattest parts of the hourglass here. Now, when you move on to the literature review, the idea is to take this really big, broad urban question and now make it more specific. I've been pushing you to have scholarly justification for the three concepts that you built your paper around. So do you see how that's getting a bit more compressed? Instead of being this one big question, now it's organized around three conceptual ideas, okay? Data analysis is easily the most specific because you're measuring stuff now. So you're just interpreting quantitative information, but not necessarily applying it to the overarching question just yet, because that will come in the sociological analysis. So notice how now we are zooming out again. And the sociological analysis needs to be about as specific, no more, no less, as the literature review was. The lit review was meant to establish these three concepts of great importance to your paper. The sociological analysis is meant to expand on that and connect the three concepts to each other with the backing of the data. Okay. And then finally, you wrap up. I realize that writing a conclusion absolutely sucks after you've written a long paper. Nobody really wants to write a conclusion because we're all just kind of out of energy at that point. But nevertheless, the conclusion's important. That's where you restate the findings of the paper. You speculate a little bit about the future of this social problem, and you want to suggest a policy or two that you feel might work to alleviate this social problem, okay? That policy, I'm not going to be grading that as if we were in a public policy master's program. There are people that get paid a lot of money to come up with policies that don't actually work. So what I'll be looking for you to do there is suggest something. If you propose an urban problem and then identify three social concepts that relate to that problem and provide theoretical and quantitative backing for that problem, for that concept being important in your explanation for the problem, I would like your policy to be very specific to these concepts that you've already identified. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, by the time this video goes live, you are going to see both a rubric and an instructions guideline posted to the course page that lay out exactly what I'm looking for and exactly how I will be grading your final paper when it comes time to actually read it in a few weeks. But in the interest of talking this through with you, let's go through briefly the 5 components here and the key thing each one needs to do. Now, when you write your paper's introduction, and this should be about 1 to 1.5 pages, 1 page to 1.5 pages, you want to establish the paper's research question, right? Tell me a bit about the city, tell me a bit about the problem, and ask the question. When I say establish the research question, you don't want to beat around the bush on this. You absolutely want to literally write down the question. This paper asks why St. Louis has such high crime rates, something like that, right? Like why this is the city with the highest violent crime rates in the country. That would just be a very clear question that is actually asked within the confines of the paper's introduction. Now, secondly, you want to propose a very strong, clear thesis sentence. So using that example from the research question about St. Louis and violent crime, what does a thesis sentence has to do? It needs to tell me, it has to provide a roadmap for where this paper is going. So you will essentially answer that question in 1 to 2 very clear and strong sentences. So I might say, violent crime in St. Louis is a byproduct of the city's extremely segregated urban neighborhoods, skills mismatch among within the vulnerable populations, and endemic social class inequality and poverty rates spread throughout the city. Okay, so that's telling me the three things that I'm going to be proposing as explanations and answers to this question. These are the two things I'm really looking for in the intro. Do you ask a question, and do you provide a thesis statement that tells me how you will answer this question, okay? And in particular, the thesis statement has to reference the major concepts. Otherwise, it's not a real thesis statement. The whole point of the thesis statement is to identify and tell your reader what are the major conceptual arguments that you're going to be making here. And for those of you, especially those of you who are not graduating, I hope that this is something that you take with you beyond this class, like how to write long papers in an organized and coherent fashion. You always have a pretty significant amount of academic freedom in terms of how you write this, but these are things you always have to do in a research project. You always have to provide a question and provide a thesis that demonstrates what the answer to that question is going to be. So that's the intro. Try to write about a page and a half on that. Use your proposal as your rough draft, but what you need to be implementing into this is the question and the thesis sentence. So you don't want to just copy and paste and use that, because I will know and I will grade that harshly. I do want to see evidence that you've revised this according to all the other work that you've done on this project since, okay? Now, when it comes to the literature review, I had you collect 7 pieces of scholarly literature and summarize them, and now you want to be connecting those to your topic. What you want to be doing here is, again, I would use that literature review as your rough draft here, but you want to be connecting them with strong transition sentences, and you want to be organizing them around starting with what you feel is most important, going down to what you feel is least important. Organize it from most important to least important. It's not rocket science there. Lead with your strongest piece of information and theorize downward from there. Each one of your major concepts, again, you have 3 here, each one needs to have at least some element of scholarly support, because if you have a whole section in your sociological analysis that I feel wasn't previewed or wasn't established in the lit review, that's going to be something that is graded down, right? I need to see that these things connect to one another, okay? And that's what I was trying to offer you in feedback on your literature review. Like, as you're building out this project, do you have a piece of literature that can stand in and support a conceptual idea? You did not pick these topics at random, nor did you pick your literature at random. It had to be something that connected to what you were trying to prove here, okay? So you will write, I think the lit review with 7 sources and your transition sentences and your bookends to the section, I think your lit review should be at least 3 to 4 pages. But again, you probably already have a good portion of that written already. So take what you have and use that to build the rest of this section. And so if you notice, again, let's not lose track of the connections here. The literature, the introduction establishes these major explanatory concepts. And the literature review describes the scholarly research on those concepts that you have collected and identified. Hopefully that makes sense. Feel free to reach out if there are any questions or concerns from this point on. Because the next section is, okay, in the lit review, I described theoretically what other people have done regarding these concepts. Now in the data analysis, you are actually providing and describing quantitative information that demonstrates that those concepts really do exist. So if you are talking about violent crime and you say segregation's a major factor in this, okay, well, I cited, let's say, Ruth Peterson and Laurie Crevo in order to establish that, yeah, scholars have written about this. But now you need to demonstrate that it actually exists within the neighborhood or the city that you have highlighted as the unit of analysis for your paper. And so then I would look at something like, all right, well, look, here's you might have citywide data that shows that there's a lot of racial or ethnic diversity, but then you might have one neighborhood that's, let's say, 95 to 97% Black. Not uncommon in the Northeast and the Midwest to see that in segregated environments. So I would look at that and say, look, right there, I said that segregation was important for violent crime, and here it is. Here is evidence of it happening within this city that I've chosen to talk about, right? Are you doing gentrification in Brooklyn, for example? Okay, well, I told you that gentrification leads to a higher socioeconomic status in the area, right? It's not me, this is you writing this. You told me that. And now, here, look at this. From 2009 to 2018, the percentage of people with a college degree went up 15%. The median income went up $10,000, right? Like that's a way to, those three concepts you've identified, each one needs support from at least a variable in the data table, right? You did not select these concepts at random, and you did not select these data indicators at random. So here's the point where I very much ask you to show me you can connect numerical information to conceptual arguments to the overarching theme of the paper. I hope you can see, as I'm laying out what you're trying to do here, I hope you can see that if you're disciplined, if you can be very disciplined in how you're writing, this is easy, right? This is actually an easier project than it appears to be, because all you have to do is make sure that you are connecting the dots across your information. You don't need to write at random. You should never be sitting down here saying, I don't know what to write here. No. You should be sitting down saying, okay, I wrote this in the last section, and that naturally leads me to writing something very related in this subsequent section. Now, if that's making sense, that's the stuff you've done. You've already written drafts of these three sections, and I commend you for making sure you were on top of these things. Now, the most important section of your paper is the sociological analysis. That's where you are going to do two things. You will explain how you feel, the mechanism, the concept that you've identified, like what's the mechanism that connects it to the outcome. You might say that segregation is related to violent crime. Here's where you're explaining why. You might say that gentrification is related to a rising social class within the neighborhood. Now tell me why that is. Use your lecture material here. Use the stuff that's been assigned to you, but make it very specific to the city in question. And that's where the data is very helpful to you here. The ability to use that data wisely to be the missing link between theoretical concept and reality on the ground of a specific section. So you will want to be explaining here three things. What's the point of these concepts for my problem, for my urban social problem? Two, how does this help answer my question, right? Connect it to the outcome, actually connect it through a social mechanism. When I say mechanism, I mean, what's the thing? What is it about concept one that specifically causes or relates to the outcome that I have built my entire paper around? And then finally, how do these ideas connect to each other? Really, how do these ideas connect to each other? Segregation and skills of spatial mismatch theory are intimately related to one another. So connect these three, okay? Now, how should you be organizing them? Well, in your lit review, I asked you to organize most important to least important. Do the same thing here. And I would signpost a little bit. I would put subheadings. You should have one big heading for sociological analysis, and then a subheading for concept one, segregation, concept two, labor markets, right? Concept three, population decline. I don't know. Like it's got to be specific to your paper. But I'm a big believer that organization, very clear, coherent, and specific organization goes a very, very long way to making this an easy section to write. So once I have that, I'm pretty much done here. Okay, so let's kind of go through the process of the paper. 1 to 1.5 pages for your introduction. 3 to 4 pages for your literature review. 2 to maybe 2.5 pages for your data analysis. I would say 3 to 4 pages for your sociological analysis. Try to write about a page to a page and a quarter for each section, for each one of these concepts that we've like really crystallized as being part of our paper. And then you just need to not lose energy and finish up with a conclusion. Voila, restate the main idea of your paper. Tell me what it is the paper accomplished, and then suggest a policy that may work to alleviate the problem you just examined. So for example, again, let's stick with violent crime, for example. You may say, one of the issues with violent crime is people of a very disadvantaged social group are segregated in very isolated urban areas. This creates a spatial mismatch between where they could find labor market opportunities and where these people are actually living. So now, if you can suggest a policy that either sucks economic activity into those isolated neighborhoods or does a better job of connecting those neighborhoods to places where jobs they would take are actually located, that should be in the conclusion here, right? If you want to suggest some type of citywide public transportation system, that's always something I enjoy hearing about. So yeah, suggest a policy or two that you feel will alleviate the problem, but it can't come out of nowhere. It can't. It has to be connected to the theme of the paper. Now, hopefully that all makes sense. Now, in terms of integrating the data, this is what I've really been building towards, because students, like, again, one of the problems that a lot of college students face when they sit down to write a paper like this is they don't really know how to integrate the data. If I were you, I would practice outlining a flow chart. And by the time this video goes live, you will see an outlining exercise posted to the course page. This is not required of you or graded, but I will just say this. The students who complete that flow chart, complete that practice outline, and send it to me for feedback are going to be the students that do the best. I'm not just predicting that. I absolutely know it at this point. I know it through the experience that I have teaching these kinds of courses. So what you will see there is it's helpful for me and for you to see, okay, here's the concept that I am interested in. Then write down right below it, what's the first citation I have that connects to that concept? What's the second citation I have that connects to that concept? That's going to be the connection from the intro to the lit review. Then write down under each citation, what are the variables, the quantitative numbers that I collected that are connections and evidence of these concepts, and then write in 1 to 2 sentences a quick mechanism of why that concept connects to the outcome, the major question of the paper. If you can do that for all 3 of your concepts, you are in good shape at that point. If you can't, it means you have to go back to the data a little bit, or you mean to have to go back to Google Scholar and try to find some additional research that is going to help you make the case here. And that's it, right? The students who spend more time planning will have to spend less time writing. The students who spend less time planning will have to spend a hell of a lot more time writing, and it will likely be writing worse. We always do better when we write with a purpose, when we know what each paragraph needs to accomplish. I am willing to work with you, obviously, over the next few weeks to make sure that you guys are doing okay with this, really. Like, make sure that you guys are feeling confident about the paper. The conclusion should be about a page to 2 pages. Add that up, you're at 12 to 15 pages, no problem. And that's one of the major things I want students to get out of this is the realization that I can do difficult things. I can write an extensive semester-long research project. Trust yourself, trust me to offer feedback to your writing here, and we're all going to get through this okay, despite the fact that I have to, obviously I can't do any of these like peer editing exercises or offer feedback in person the way I normally would. We're all going to get through this. Trust your information and trust your reader here, which is me. Obviously I have to grade it, but I'm happy to read sections of this paper in advance before I actually grade them, right? Because when I read the final product, I have to read with a very critical eye, right? That's the goal of a professor. That's the job of a professor. But when I read a couple weeks before the due date, if you can get certain things done and send it to me for feedback, I can read it as your friend at that point, or I can just read that as a very encouraging critic, like not looking to take points away. I can give encouragement about how to do better in certain areas. Again, the students who take this seriously, it's another reason why I kind of like these types of projects, is because they do separate who's taking it seriously and who isn't, okay? If you're feeling at all concerned about your ability to succeed on this, now's the time to reach out and talk to me about that. Thank you very much. And no video on Friday. Class was originally canceled that Friday to account for the Easter holiday. So I'll just say happy Easter. Eat some Cadbury cream eggs. I always find it amusing that, like, every year since I'm 32 years old, every year since I was a little boy, it is the same Cadbury cream egg commercial that's been airing on television for 25 straight years. And that's them just saying, we don't need to spend money on recording a new commercial. You won't buy this stuff regardless. and I do buy this stuff regardless. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend, and I'll be back on Monday. Bye-bye.